Hey, this is Game Design Study Group thing. My name is this, and I'm going to be talking about these. Yeah, I wish. I'm actually going to be talking about these in more or less kind of a similar way to the way that these guys talk about those things. And specifically today, I'm going to be talking about stories in video games, storytelling in video games. But before I do that, about my last video, I know I do have a lot of bitter resentment, and it may or may not be justified, but I am trying to let it go. So the past is in the past, and I'm just trying to move forward. So bear with me while I work on that. Okay, the elements of a story. For my purposes today, the elements of a story are characters, settings, situations, and plot. And does a video game have to have these things? Do all video games have these things? I'm going to say no. Tetris is the classic example of a game without a story, without a context. It's purely abstract. But my current theory is that having a good context for your game will always give you some advantages over being a purely abstract game like Tetris. And that's what I'm going to go with for now. Then, video games that do have stories. Because video games are interactive, a good story for a video game is basically one that facilitates interaction. Now, if you are a designer and you have a story to tell, then your interaction will also have to facilitate a good story. Feedback loop kind of thing. So as far as character and settings go, classical storytelling mediums only had to worry about portraying those characters and settings in ways that were believable for their individual contexts. Games have to worry about letting the player interact with any characters and settings in ways that are believable for the context of the game. And partly because video games are still new, and partly because that's probably just naturally harder to do, we're still figuring out how to make that work well. Create characters that can be interacted with believably in the context, and figuring out what kinds of characters can be interacted with believably in their contexts. Same thing for settings. We're still trying to figure it out. There are definitely tricks you can use to get past some of those challenges, so long as you remember that video games are interactive and you're not writing characters or writing settings that are for a classical storytelling medium. And then situations. So, first of all, gameplay and story should not be thought of as two different things. This is probably the biggest mistake that a lot of games make, treating their gameplay and their story like they're parallel but not connected, and that's basically a bad idea. You shouldn't do that. You're always gonna, feedback loop. We want to have positive feedback loops. We don't want to treat them like two separate parallel things. And as far as situations and plots go, here's one way that I think is a good way to think about it. Gameplay of any sort is basically a simulation of a situation. And then situations and series are what make up a plot. For games, I think that's a good way to look at it. I would say that most classical forms of storytelling, books and movies, theater, tended to focus primarily on the plot, the events that happen, their causes, their effects, and the effects that those events have on the characters. As far as storytelling is concerned for video games, the focus should probably be more so on the situation than on the overarching plot. And the plot should probably be thought of as just a tool from moving from one situation to the next situation. In a lot of cases. Not in every case. Okay, let's talk about a few examples. Telltale Games and BioWare do a good job of letting the player feel like the plot is important to the experience and that the player has a meaningful and believable influence on how the plot develops. Shadow of Colossus is a case where the plot is pretty much just as complex as it needs to be to create a more meaningful context to the gameplay. But in the case of Shadow of Colossus, the gameplay is also used to make the story more meaningful. Online competitive games, like League of Legends, Dota, and MechWarrior Online, they have characters and settings and situations, but they basically don't have any kind of overarching plot at all. And by virtue of being competitive, that's probably what makes the most sense. I don't think there's really any other reasonable approach to take, but I think we'll probably see some Kickstarter attempts and other attempts, so we'll see what becomes of competitive gameplay combined with overarching plot. Basically, I'm not sure it's ever going to work well, but we'll see. And really, the bottom line is that as an industry, we should really know this already, and maybe the designers do, but the publishers don't care, and that's another problem with our industry. But anyway, the bottom line is this. Trying to add the kind of plot that makes sense and works well for a movie or a book into a video game is never going to work well. That doesn't mean that plot is unimportant for video games, just that it requires a very different approach and even a different skill set than designing plots for other storytelling mediums. And the last point I want to make is that video games have a lot of different means and techniques that they can use to actually convey the story. The context, explain the situation. You can do that through cutscenes, you can do that through optional or non-optional text, you can do that through the environment, you can do that through dialogue snippets. But one of my personal favorites is narration over gameplay. Supergiant Games and Thomas Was Alone are two great examples of how to do this well. I know that some people find narration over gameplay annoying, so feel free to explain why you hold to that position in the comments, and I'll check out what you have to say. But for now, cool. If you're hanging out at the tree line, be careful that I don't see you first.